All right. Welcome to the Precision Protocol series, where we're going to go deep dive and nerd out on everything functional medicine and testing and all that great stuff. As always, I'm welcomed by my super smart brother from another mother, Brendan Vermeire from Metabolic Solutions. And today we're going to be talking about nervous system and brain health testing. So all right, buddy, this is your area of expertise. Let's go ahead and have you kick it off. So where do you start when we're talking about neuroinflammation and brain health testing?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me back. I was out on a nature walk the other day because it was like 50 degrees. And I literally was thinking about you. I'm like, that dude is just on a different level. So the smarty pants in me sees and honors the smarty pants in you. I'm just like, gosh, goals. But no, this will be a super fun topic. I put up a post on social today kind of in honor of this episode, and people are responding very well to it because I think there's this crux here of adverse childhood events, early life stress, trauma, and the lasting biological effects that it can have for potentially your whole life and the implications of. And I think with today's conversation, like what I hope we can do, present some of the evidence that we know from the research, but then more importantly, some of these mechanisms and pathways that we might get into, it may or may not be pertinent or relevant to each individual, right? So there's these different sort of blocks and chunks. There's the kind of epigenetic expression side of it, of how does trauma and stress change the epigenetics. There's the neuroendocrine side of it, of how it affects the HPA axis and cortisol rhythms and catecholamine metabolism. But then, of course, also there's this immunological priming and dysregulation that can then potentially lead to higher levels of inflammation or autoimmunity. So I'm excited to kind of unpack this and look at some of the biomarkers, the testing, or even biometrics and wearables like HRV.
Yeah. So, one of the things I think would be a good starting point for us is, I think historically when people think about kind of trauma, they think of it as a emotion, but they don't actually think about it being connected to physiology. And I think with a lot of kind of the newer thought leaders like yourself, Dr. Amy Piggin, with kind of the biology of trauma, how would you really explain that connection between what is kind of a traumatic emotional experience and how that actually connects into a biological?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of $1 million question. And I think the research has come a long ways just in the past, 10, 20 years. And I've got Amy coming on my podcast, I think next week, to talk about her new book. And I'm excited to have that conversation because I've heard bits and pieces of some of her work. And so, historically, right, you think about kind of the dark ages of, soldiers coming back from war and kind of the post-shock syndrome and all of that. And then, okay, PTSD comes along, but now that's even evolved of now there's CPTSD, more complex, and kind of these different, sub-activation states within the PTSD umbrella. But yeah, historically, we just thought of it more as like, okay, you experienced this sort of emotionally traumatic event, but then it was kind of this like, well, you just got to like get over it sort of thing. But now we have a much deeper understanding of how this really does alter the biology potentially for a very long time. And I think my speculation, my opinion would be, I think it starts as this massive stress response through the HPA axis, which we all know about, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, starting with the corticotropin releasing hormone, signaling to the pituitary to release the ACTH and tell the adrenals to release, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. I think that's how it starts. But then I think there's this deeper potential imprinting where it can change the DNA methylation pattern. So how the actual genetics are expressing through kind of the language of using a methyl tag to kind of downregulate a gene and an acetyl tag to kind of upregulate a gene. And so I think there's a lot of cool research being done with that of like, but how is it changing the gene expression? Like if it's, upregulating pro-inflammatory cytokine genes, for example, or upregulating the expression of the stress hormones. So I think it really starts with HPA axis, but then also I think that primes different neural circuits in different regions of the brain that then creates a potential like maladaptation where, we're forced to sort of integrate, like we just had this horrible experience and apparently that's possible in this world that we live in. So now how do I kind of change my default mode network to almost prepare for, could that ever happen again? So I think a great example would be, if a child in a family got in a horrible car accident, maybe the parents tragically, deceased and the kid lived, okay, when that kid turns 16, they're probably going to be kind of resistant to getting a driver's license and getting in a car. And obviously it's not logical, driving a car is generally going to be kind of safe, but because of that, there's going to be this kind of neuroplastic imprint of, cars are bad, getting on the road is dangerous, and I could experience that traumatic event. So I think that becomes the tricky part, is how do we sort of dismantle that, false belief or that adaptation to the trauma, which then kind of requires a lot of neuroplasticity and let alone all the inner work and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think it's super interesting these days where people are talking about the concept of imprinting and the Michael Pollan, how to change your mind, and people are talking about psychedelics to kind of break those imprinted memories that are kind of carrying forward. But kind of let's talk about it from like a physiological biomarker standpoint. You talk about kind of imprinting the HPA axis. Most people know sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Right. So somebody has that trauma, they're in a heightened parasympathetic sympathetic state. And that's kind of carried forward. People kind of have seen those types of personalities, but how would one actually translate that to what they see on, say, a lab test or other biomarkers that they could possibly measure?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of practitioners are probably using, Dutch tests or urine cortisol and cortisol metabolites. Dutch test just kind of being the most popular one, but pretty foundational, looking at the diurnal rhythm of the cortisol. Now, I think though too, like the model of, acute reactivity and kind of the exhaustive phase and the compensatory phase, I think that model is a little more outdated, the adrenal fatigue model, because I think our hormones are pretty responsive. I think they can change pretty quickly. Like if you do somebody, and I've certainly seen it anecdotally over and over again, where you might have somebody that maybe it's the cortisol awakening response that starts being a little bit blunted as sort of the stress response is so chronic that it starts faltering, versus like hypothetically, if somebody just had, traumatic event recently, like let's say within a week or two, I mean, I would suspect that their cortisol is probably going to be pretty high across the board and maybe a funky pattern, along with like the catecholamines, like the HVA, VMA metabolites as well. I don't think there's any way to really predict though. I think everybody's going to have their unique pattern depending on where are they in like the more acute response or, chronic, and how much have they been able to like regulate, their nervous system since then to try to bring it back to more of a allostatic harmony. So that's where we can, assess the diurnal rhythm. And then are we trying to like lower it at a certain time of day, raise it at a certain time of day? But more importantly, it's like, how can we make this person feel more safe within their nervous system? And that's where I think like the HRV is one of the most just valuable tools to use for that, because it's really reflective of that parasympathetic, sympathetic, autonomic tone.
Yeah. So how would you do it?
So like if I had a new client and they're, reporting more recent trauma, or then if you're digging into their history of like, oh, how was your childhood, and using like ACE questionnaires and stuff like that, I would absolutely do. Lately I've been doing more like serum AM cortisol, just part of a blood panel to keep it cheap and easy. But I'd want to do a full urine or saliva cortisol diurnal rhythm, along with definitely a lot of blood markers, looking at I'd probably look at the cortisol in the blood as well, but more so looking at different inflammatory and immunological indices, because I kind of want to see, okay, what's going on with your stress hormones, and then how could that be possibly impacting like your immune system or your intestines, microbiome, and inflammatory markers. Because I think if it's just like a little bit of adrenal dysfunction and the cortisol and stress hormones are funky, that by itself, I don't think would be too hard to work with necessarily. But then when it starts cascading into like the immune cell priming and the inflammation and the mast cell activation and intestinal permeability and stuff, that's where I think things get a little bit more messy and complicated. And it depends on the severity of it, right? I think maybe some people might be a little bit more sensitive to trauma and stress, and others might be a little bit more resilient.
So, and then kind of shifting gears a little bit, maybe let's talk about HRV, right? Maybe just do a quick definition, and then why we would kind of see that as a potential kind of trackable biomarker per se, and how it can be done.
Yeah, I've never been a wearable guy myself. I dabbled with, HRV heart rate strap, but more like in the early days before Aura and Whoop and all that kind of
Mhm.
took off. Um, because I guess for me, actually, I think it was Ryan Monahan posted something on Facebook today that was like there are these different levels of, level 1, no wearable, level 2, 3, 4, wearable, level 5 is no
Mhm.
wearable, because kind of the idea of using the wearable to get in tune with your body. And I'm a little bit
Mhm.
of that mindset. However, I think HRV is an amazing tool, non-invasive. You can track it in real time every day, looking at the variability of your heart rate. A lower variability is going to be more advantageous as opposed to higher variability. And looking at or I might have gotten that backwards, but looking at the PTSD research in particular, they're looking at HRV as a direct measure of autonomic tone in PTSD. So in general, if we're thinking about HRV from the perspective of, somebody more sympathetic toned and dominant, more stress hormones, cortisol,
Mhm.
catecholamines, versus, more allostatic, and, within
Mhm.
that kind of neuroendocrine bliss, if you will. So the HRV just becomes a very useful tool. So you can see, like, all right, my lifestyle, or if I have a panic attack, or if I get a good night of sleep, how is that altering the variability of the heart rate?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we work with a number of different areas where HRV can come in. The kind of the most well recognized would be heart math, because of its kind of biofeedback and really focusing on giving you that coherent score relative to kind of your breath work, which I thought was always a lot more useful for me than just basic meditation, even though it's basically the same concept, right? But you get
Mm-hmm.
that numerical feedback from the device itself.
Yeah, like one of my friends, Kyle Berquist with Reputable Health, their whole research platform
Mhm.
is very much based on wearables, Aura and Whoop. And so I've looked at a lot of PTSD research showing individuals with PTSD and more trauma generally have a lower HRV score, showing that they're a little bit more sympathetic dominant. And so there is a lot of that's what is exciting of like the HRV trauma research, and then of course like with psychedelics for trauma and all of that, because it's how do we restore allostasis? How do we bring down any inflammation? There's different studies looking at, well, people with PTSD tend to have higher inflammatory markers. And we also know from mechanistic studies, a lot of like traumatizing lab rat studies, unfortunately, but they traumatize the lab rats and then see, oh, pro-inflammatory biomarkers going up, stress hormones going up. So all part of the cascade. And that's where even like the CRH released by was it the hypothalamus, I think, directly can activate mast cells, for example. And so like with the mast cell activation craze, it's like not even the cortisol, but the CRH upstream of that can directly induce intestinal permeability, activate mast cells. So it can definitely set off this sort of immunological inflammatory event.
Mhm. So let's talk about neuroimmune and microglia. So maybe kind of go through some definitions. I know this is kind of yeah your space. So fire away.
Yeah, you're throwing me a softball here, and I'll take it. I'll take it. Yeah, so this idea of immune cell priming, I think, is pretty important. And the way I like to describe it analogically is kind of like, obviously, if you as a human are just really stressed out, you're really worn down, you're going to be kind of hyper reactive, right? Jen says something, and you're just like, gosh, dang it, just more
Mhm.
reactive than you should be because you've been stressed out too long. And so thinking about that analogy with your immune cells of like, how do you think your immune cells are going to behave if they've been sort of like marinating in too much cortisol and stress hormone for too long? Because, we know stress, like cortisol acutely is more anti-inflammatory, but then chronically, if we have too much cortisol exposure for too long, it actually primes the immune cells, including the innate immune cell of the brain, the microglia, to be more sensitive to triggers. So if you think about that of like, okay, you have the stress, you have the trauma, that gets the stress hormone surging, that does affect your brain and excitatory networks. But then it's also priming those microglia and astrocytes, those immune cells of the brain, to be more responsive to some sort of trigger. So then if you think, well, also the stress hormone could induce intestinal permeability, provocate mast cells. I mean, all of this is setting the stage for blood-brain barrier permeability, and that microglia immune cell priming. So then, like a little bit of lipopolysaccharide or some pro-inflammatory cytokines mixed with the stress hormones, those microglia can have kind of an exacerbated inflammatory reaction to whatever the stimuli is. And so then they're getting morphed into their pro-inflammatory kind of cytokine storm and blasting all these pro-inflammatory mediators that can actually damage our neural networks. And so actually the neurolongevity index that I was telling you about yesterday is kind of exactly that, of looking at this composite score of, okay, do we see astrocyte activation? Do we see astrocyte damage, which would essentially tell us that we have blood-brain barrier permeability or leaky brain and some degree of neuroinflammation. But then also there's a third marker that can be reflective of the actual brain cell damage or neuronal damage. So, I mean, I haven't really announced the neurolongevity index to the world yet, but that's really what that score was, is so that way, in an ideal world, if I was working with somebody with self-reported, trauma and stress and whatnot, I think the cortisol rhythm, pre and post, like 3 months apart, but then having them track their HRV on a more daily, regular basis, but also getting like the neurolongevity index pre and post. So that way we're looking at like the neuroendocrine and the neuroimmune, but then using the HRV to kind of like fine tune on a daily basis. That would be a pretty good recipe.
Yeah. And so I know you have your particular blood panel, but what are like kind of those specific biomarkers for neuroinflammation, and how do you tease those out relative to just your general HSCRP, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's what's been fun is like the mental map that I created like 7 years ago. It was basically, I was on the hunt for what are those markers, and it's taken me a good 7-8 years to kind of pin it down, but I think I'm finally there. Because like good old fashioned C-reactive protein, it's awesome, primarily liver in origin in response to interleukin 6. But CRP itself has been shown to induce paracellular blood-brain barrier permeability, aka as CRP goes up, that can induce a leaky brain independently, and it can also then stimulate the glial system. But also even the glial cells seem to be able to produce C-reactive protein locally in the brain. So CRP is still very valuable from metabolic inflammation, systemic inflammation. But I think the higher the CRP, the more that you can presume that they may have some degree of leaky brain and neuroinflammation. But then there's other more specific markers, specifically S100B protein, which is neurotrophic and kind of neuroprotective at low levels, but then neurotoxic at high levels. And so that's kind of the first check engine light signal when the astrocytes that maintain your blood-brain barrier get activated, is they'll start producing higher levels of this S100B protein. But then as the astrocytes get worn down and damaged and even necrotic, then they'll start kind of spilling out this glial fibrillary acidic protein that's a structural protein. So then we have like kind of the early indicator, but then also the structural indicator. And then finally, the third marker is neurofilament light chain that then would indicate like, hey, not only is the brain leaky and inflamed, but so much so that it's causing excess brain cell damage that we can measure in the blood as well.
Yeah. And so those are all blood-based biomarkers.
Mm-hmm.
And where do you run your testing through?
Historically, DHA. I'm going to get DHA, Vexia to both have those available.
Yeah.
Because, LabCorp, I don't know about Quest, but LabCorp is the originator.
Yeah, and LabCorp has quite a few proprietary panels that I think they run specific to this application. So let's talk a little bit about urine-based neurotoxin testing. Where are your thoughts on that? What are some options out there? We obviously DHA and cryptopyrrole. Would love to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, all the above. I'll do the urine neurotransmitters first and then hit cryptopyrrole, because I think, like we were saying off air, urine neurotransmitters, we can measure the whole monoamine neurotransmitter, serotonin, dopamine, glutamate, GABA, all of them, acetylcholine. But then we also have all the different metabolites, 5-HIAA, kynurenic acid, quinolinic. And I'll say on quinolinic, I think quinolinic acid has a lot of potential as like a neuroinflammatory, neurotoxic marker. I don't think it's there yet, though, at least not being specific to the central nervous system. I think the quinolinic acid is more so coming from activated peripheral macrophages, not so much the CNS. And so with like urine neurotransmitters, it's one of those, like, I want to love it. I would prefer to run it on everybody, even just for research purposes. But even like we're getting ready to launch our neurotransmitters course. And so I went super deep into all the research. And it's one of those, I just don't think urinary neurotransmitters is quite validated enough that we can use it clinically in like a predictive way. But there are, as we were saying off air, patterns, right? Like I have seen time and time and time again, whether we look at like plasma levels of 5-HIAA or whole blood serotonin, or look at it in the urine. And I even had some clients that I did the blood and the urine to see, is the blood and urine telling the same story, or are they, completely different? But I do think we can get some insight, because like if you have somebody on an SSRI or 5-HTP, like we both take, it will blast the serotonin metabolite really, really high, SSRI or 5-HTP. Now, the 5-HTP, that makes sense because it's the nutritional precursor. But I thought it's interesting that even the SSRIs themselves, which, it's not a substrate, it's not a cofactor, it's a reuptake inhibitor, but even that actually really inflates the 5-HIA over and over again. So I think the urine neurotransmitters has a lot of potential, but I do think those urine levels are heavily influenced by the peripheral nervous system, and the gut, the enterochromaffin cells of the gut and the psychobiome. So like I said earlier, I think like Vibrant just announced the gut zoomer neurotransmitter combo. And that's smart to me, because I think what they're going for is like, all right, well, let's look at the microbiota composition and the inflammatory markers. And I would think like the more maybe dysbiotic and leaky and inflamed the gut is, I think that could then dramatically alter the level of the neurotransmitters in the urine.
Yeah. Do you want to flip over to the test?
Yeah. Let's do it.
Yeah. So I ran a new brain health test, which is by Healthy Longer. They're rebranding as Healthy Mentis. So Steven Schindler and I met at the Hicks conference actually we met at PLMI, but he came to the Hicks conference. I took the test. So this is a long test report. We'll just kind of jump to page 10. But yeah, so we'll kind of just walk through these and some of their kind of groupings from the different ones. So this is now the inhibitory neurobiomarkers. So we want to just kind of bang through those far away.
Yeah, I was looking at your results earlier ahead of time, and it's one of those like, and I know because you're all about the data and the analytics and the correlations between the data points. Because obviously, like I can look at this and just sort of anecdotally spitball on like, well, what I know about Jeremy and the way that his brain works, like I noticed that a lot of the excitatory were kind of, eyeballing proportionately higher than the inhibitory. And I'm like, well, I mean, Jeremy seems like a pretty high speed, like high glutamate, kind of guy. But that's the hard thing, is it's hard to look at the quantity of excitatory and inhibitory and predict, what symptoms they're expressing. And we can try to draw like loose correlations of like, let's say, Jeremy has a lot of anxiety or something. And it's like, well, if he has, excess glutamate and histamine and tyrosine and whatnot that are just very stimulating in general, like that might track a little bit. Now, how we modulate those would be a little bit like, what do you do? Starve yourself of certain amino acids or pump certain freeform amino acids? Like, I think I saw you were low in glycine, maybe as kind of an inhibitory neurotransmitter, or you mentioned taking 5-HTP a little bit. So it's almost like I try to look at the individual, but then zooming out a little bit, because the way I think of it is, obviously we've been conditioned to think of mental illness as like a brain chemical imbalance. And generally people are thinking that means the neurotransmitters, but then there's all the other signaling molecules that are mixed in with the neurotransmitters, the cytokines, the chemokines, the steroid hormones, the neurotrophic factors, the thyroid hormones. So then it becomes this more complicated kind of brain milieu or soup of, well, how many, pro-inflammatory versus anti-inflammatory, or excitatory versus inhibitory. And then it's like, well, what's the net effect of all of that signaling? So I'm kind of curious, like, how do your results resonate with you, with knowing, your supplements and your cognitive function?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a super A type, generally a bit anxious. And that's kind of what I put in there as my qualifying criteria. But I'm also CompT heterozygous, MTHFR. I don't think when I was taking this, so I do take a NAC glycine. I've done both the NAC glycine from Pure Encapsulations. That's been out of stock, so I'm on the Cellcore Glycan Active. I do like that, just as a general, methyl precursor, kind of the composite needs. And then I do take 5-HTP. I do feel a lot better when I take it on a daily basis. When I run out, I notice when I run out. I feel slightly more anxious as well. So when I talked with the clinical team, they recommended obviously additional amino acids, mainly specific to tyrosine, which my current amino acid stack does not have. So I'll be looking at that. They also mentioned looking at a MOA inhibitor. MOA. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, like a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Yeah. It's kind of like OG psychiatry back in I think the 80s and 90s and stuff. The market was dominated by monoamine oxidase inhibitors.
Yeah. Yeah. And then vitamin B9 and B6, getting a bit more glutamine into my, from my diet, beans, nuts, etc. So it's pretty interesting test. I mean, obviously it's fairly differentiated from the regular testing that I would do, from microbiome to the hormone, both blood and metabolite, along with, toxin testing as well. So there's quite a bit of information. How much overlap is this with, say, an organic acids test?
Yeah. Great question. A little bit, but not a ton, right? Because organic acids, Mosaic or Genova with the metabolomics, they all measure the HVA, VMA, looking at the ratio, maybe DOPAC as an intermediate of dopamine metabolism, and then the serotonin metabolite, 5-HIAA, along with the kynureninic acid and quinolinic acid, and that used to be reported as a ratio. But you don't get all the others, and you don't get the whole neurotransmitter, just the metabolites. And I think, with this, where you get kind of a lot of the metabolites plus the whole neurotransmitters, because I noticed I think your tryptophan was kind of high, but then was it your serotonin or 5-HIAA? Yeah. So tryptophan optimal, serotonin kind of low, 5-HIAA, kind of optimal. Because you opened up there's that whole other dynamic that you kind of alluded to there of, COMT and MAO polymorphisms. So even I had a guy comment on one of my posts. I put up a post about 5-HIAA 5-HTP, because I was curious, well, what's the research on the efficacy of 5-HTP? And honestly, it was kind of disappointing. It wasn't as, the efficacy of 5-HTP is really not as established as something like saffron, for SSRI effects. However, you're reporting, it helps you. I know for me, if I don't take my 5-HTP, I'm not a happy camper. So I actually, back when I was 23, I kind of hypothesized, because that's when I was studying methylation through Ben Lynch and stuff like that. But I was oh, well, maybe I have a tryptophan hydroxylase polymorphism, and I can't really effectively convert tryptophan to 5-HTP. Now, I mean, I do have a polymorphism in that gene, but do I know if that's explaining why I don't seem to make serotonin very well? I don't know. But I'm very dependent on the 5-HTP, or L-DOPA. I mean, levodopa is used to treat Parkinson's, but you can still use it to, get the dopamine flowing a little bit too. But I think the organic acids really is just overlapping with the metabolites. But I think if you want the full neurotransmitters, you'll get, just more data points out of it.
Yeah. I think the only other kind of pseudo interesting thing is I was at optimal or low, except for the xanthurenic acid metabolite, which I have no idea what that is.
That one is thought to be a B6 indicator. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the higher it is, the more B6. I might have to dig into that one, because the methylmalonic acid, that's gold standard, very well validated. The formimino-glutamate or FIGLU for B9, I don't think it's as established, but I think it's probably pretty on par with MMA. But yeah, the xanthurenic acid, that's thought to be a B6 indicator.
Okay. Well, awesome. Let me go ahead and get this out of here. So kind of, kind of thinking about, you getting both the self-reported assessment of trauma, getting the neuroinflammation and the ACE and HRV, how do you kind of build a protocol for somebody, you both thinking, undoing kind of the imprinting, but also supporting them from a supplement and physiological perspective.
Yeah, somebody commented on my post today about this topic and was asking like, so what's the protocol? And it's like, I don't know how I'm supposed to answer that through an Instagram comment, but this is a good, mechanism to share that. Because I mean, first and foremost, at least with my background and all the kind of coaching psychology, I'm not nearly as I'm not like a dictator practitioner. It's not like I'm prescribing and telling you this is what you have to do. I'm always like, well, how do you want to approach this, right? Because I usually see, and I was discussing this on podcast earlier, I tend to see clients and self-healers, they either really want to approach like the trauma and nervous system dysregulation more from like a like esoteric psychotherapy, craniosacral, EMDR, somatic therapy, polyvagal, and it's a lot of like, well, how do I regulate my nervous system, whether it's like grounding or Tai Chi or breath work or cold, whatever. And then other people, they'll approach it maybe a little bit more like root cause mechanism of like, is lead poisoning making me anxious? Are mycotoxins making my brain inflamed? And I want to use a bit of all the above. And so it depends on the person where they're at, where I have to meet them where they're at and obviously help them apply what they're open to and what's going to resonate with them. Because if it doesn't resonate with them, they're not going to do it. And if they're not going to do it, they're not going to get results. So, with that, I do think if they're open to different kind of therapeutic agents, whether that might be neuropsychiatric drugs with a doctor or, alternatives, amino acid therapy and different botanicals. Like this was a little bit surprising, but when I was digging into the research recently, trying to find, I think what my prompt question was, what natural supplements have comparable efficacy to SSRIs? And actually kava and lavender were actually the two that had the strongest data behind it. When I was like, well, I wouldn't have thought, but like kava and lavender and different botanicals. So I guess like, do they want pills? Do they want drugs, pills, psychedelics, botanicals, vitamins? Because you kind of alluded to like methylation earlier. And the way I teach it through my institute, I usually teach that, I think we have to optimize or at least assess and address methylation, HPA function, gut-brain axis, inflammation, kind of dealing with that because I don't think you can balance your brain chemicals or optimize the neurotransmitters if some of those upstream physiological things are disturbed. But like you mentioned psychedelic therapy earlier, and you can't not talk about psychedelics when you're talking about, trauma and PTSD because I mean, even with the emerging evidence and what evidence we have or the current clinical trials on synthetic psilocybin, and I know some people are going to be like, it's synthetic. And it's like, well, yeah, because pharma's doing it. But, I think the psychedelics are probably, with more time and research, going to emerge as by far the most powerful agents for overcoming PTSD on a lot of levels, kind of like epigenetically, physiologically, and also then kind of the spiritual, psychological side of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of there's never a silver bullet for anything, and it's a combination of everything, and it's always going to take a practitioner to kind of help guide somebody and to figure out what's going to be the biggest levers that you can pull to get somebody the most impact in the shortest amount of time.
Well, it's like exercise. I mean, obviously I'm biased because my fitness background, but also I love, how because of the emerging research, like no medical doctor could deny, the efficacy and power of just exercise. I'm not going to, say that like lifting weights or going for a run is going to cure your PTSD, but my goodness, like, if you're trying to overcome trauma and adverse childhood event, and here's a mechanistic clinical pearl, because, I don't want people to be like, oh, he's just, invalidating and saying, go lift weights. I'm like, no. Actually, like mechanistically, physiologically, it is absolutely going to give you all the feel-good hormones. It's going to have antidepressant, anxiolytic effects, and your muscles, your skeletal muscle is really the main source of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is what facilitates neuroplastic remodeling. This painting or art piece is called neurogenesis because it's all about these different mushrooms, or like lion's mane. If somebody doesn't want to do psychedelic mushrooms, they could do some lion's mane that can promote BDNF. But it's your muscle, your skeletal muscle from exercising and moving that actually is really kind of giving the fertilizer that is BDNF to your brain so you can remodel your neural networks. And in a lot of ways, trying to overcome trauma or self-limiting beliefs or whatever is holding somebody back, it really becomes this, I need to downregulate stress hormones and inflammation, and I need to upregulate and promote neurotrophic activity. So if we look at mechanistically, how do you boost neurotrophic activity, which is kind of the main mechanism of psychedelics through the serotonergic pathways, but sunlight, sleep, exercise, nutrition, like that's going to be really what drives the neuroplasticity, neurotrophic activity that allows you to rewire your brain. So, we can't overlook the holistic foundations, but if they need some kind of pill, supplement, vitamins, because even, mentioned cryptopyrrole, which that one needs more research. It's not there from a clinical validation, but I think I think it needs more research, because I've certainly seen enough blood results of like urinary cryptopyrrole is high, plasma zinc, ceruloplasmin, copper. I mean, I've used that model enough that I think it deserves more funding and research, but it's just not there yet.
Yeah. What's your take on HTMA testing, right? And how it relates to as a biomarker for neuro health?
Yeah. Even just yesterday, I was like, I've been really craving putting up a HTMA post, but I don't want to make any of my friends and colleagues mad, but literally like what little research there is explicitly says not reliable for micronutrient mineral status. Now, the redeeming quality of HTMA is more so the toxic metal excretion. So, if you have high levels of toxic metals coming out in your hair, your urine, or floating around in the blood. I actually just recently, one of my clients who is a young man with ALS, and my God, I was like choking up and trying not to cry when I met with this guy going over his lab results. But one thing that was really interesting is, his neuroimmune markers that I was talking about earlier were elevated, of course, because he has ALS. He has a true neurodegenerative disease. But interestingly, some of the etiological root causes that are more heavily associated with ALS, lead, mycotoxins, so on and so forth. And he actually it was like 3 or 4 different tests from different labs at different points in time. All of them showed high levels of lead in the hair, high levels of lead in the urine, high levels of lead in the blood. So he's actually currently going through chelation therapy, and we're doing some other stuff with that, which I have mixed feelings about chelation. But HTMA is another one of those tests. Like, I want to love it, but from like organic acids has pretty good research behind it. HTMA really does not. So, and especially I think the language that a lot of the HTMA practice, hidden calcium shell, hidden copper toxicity. And so I think the remineralization thing, candidly, it's not evidence-based. Sure, you can have anecdotal speculation, but if you're actually looking at the research, and the inter-lab variability is a big part of that. So look, maybe with more research and better research, maybe HTMA emerges as an awesome tool, but I think for now it's pretty limited to giving some insight into heavy metal exposure, similar to like a urine heavy metal test.
The convenience and the cost is you want to make it you want it to work.
Yeah. It's like $120 or something, super cheap.
Yeah, if that, I think you had to get it even pretty inexpensively. What do you kind of see on the horizon coming down in terms of improving this space in terms of neuroinflammation? You use a few nascent markers that most people aren't familiar with, or is there anything else coming soon, or other ways to look at it?
Specifically like neuroinflammatory indices.
Yeah.
Like what I want to do, I think I have nailed it down pretty well with those 3 biomarkers that I'm going to launch as the Neurolongevity Index as a scoring system. And my intention is I want to kind of serial track that index and those 3 markers in relation to some of these others. Like, I do think quinolinic acid, because there is some good research on quinolinic acid for, depression and maybe anxiety, maybe PTSD. So I think as far as like urine organic acids, I do think the quinolinic acid is one of the ones that has a lot more potential. But I have even anecdotally seen like my neurolongevity index doesn't correlate with the quinolinic acid. Now, I don't know if it's maybe part of it is like how responsive are those markers? If somebody had like a kind of leaky gut flare or something, and then it might cause like a transient spike in quinolinic acid, where some of those other blood biomarkers are more stable and take more time to build up and accumulate. So I think organic acids actually has a lot of, like even LabCorp has an organic acids profile. That's encouraging. I think if the big, medical giants are using it, that's a good sign. I think the urinary neurotransmitters will keep going, and I'm a little surprised it doesn't have more research behind it than it already does. But really, there's two markers that I want to see become commercially viable. One would be like a serum brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. I think that'll come eventually, maybe like an ELISA or something. And then the other one would be a translocator protein. So this is like one of the gold standard markers used for microglial activation, which is my whole jam, because that's like a direct indicator of microglial activation. They use it a lot in vitro research. But if we could make that a commercially available, clinical biomarker, I think that would be pretty helpful. And then like the p-tau 217, I mean, that's very like Alzheimer's specific. So it kind of depends on, are you looking for the damage caused by neurodegeneration? Are you looking for the immune activation? Are you looking at the neuronal damage or immune activation that's upstream? So I think there's a lot of really cool things on the horizon.
Yeah. Maybe just shifting gears a little bit back to kind of DNA and trauma and epigenetics. What are the connections there? How does trauma affect, what is the DNA? Because I believe there are some DNA companies that have polygenic risk scores for anxiety and stuff like that. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, genetics is one too. Like I love genetics. I do think the future of medicine is very much like precision genetic, testing and treatment. That's a huge space. What's that? True Diagnostics. Like they've been doing some really cool work in that space, and they just won some award or something I saw today. But I was actually in a meeting with them years ago, maybe like 2020 or something like that. And we were actually talking about the idea, like Ryan, William Walsh, Dan from DHA, and myself, we were talking about the idea of trying to create like a global DNA methylation score and index, with that being the idea of like, it's one thing to, identify different single nucleotide polymorphisms. And that's a tricky game because, there's over 90 million SNPs identified. Not all of them are really well clinically characterized or defined or significant. Your favorite genetic test, how many SNPs, 200, 300, 500, because there's millions, and we don't know how they're interacting or expressing themselves. It's like a, coffee stain on the blueprint. Like you don't really know how that's going to alter the architecture of the building that you're trying to build off the blueprint. But like Viome, their whole thing is like RNA is the new DNA. And I'm like, well, maybe someday, maybe. But then that DNA global methylation, the idea that we were trying to kind of kick around was, could we look at essentially the total quantity of methylation of all your genetics as a global score? Never came to fruition. And it's like, what would you really do with that, right? Because then I think people have misinterpreted like, oh, my global DNA methylation is low, so I'll just take methylated B vitamins. It's like, yeah, it doesn't really work that way. So I think there's probably a lot to do to make that like clinically viable. But I do think, some of the different SNPs, like honestly, COMT, Val 150A, whatever that one is, like there are some of those SNPs that are pretty well validated. It's just limited of like, well, now you're some degree of your predisposition, but what are you going to do about it? How are you going to really, fix the biomarker, fix the symptom, fix the expression?
Yeah, no, super interesting stuff. And, I know Ryan over at True Diagnostic, they're doing some pretty interesting testing from their whole True Age. It's not called True Age, but it's anyway, they do a lot of kind of interpretation based upon epigenetic expressions as well too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's a smart dude. I wouldn't mind running into him again.
Yeah, well, he'll be there this weekend. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll be at A4M together starting tomorrow. Anything you're excited about learning about that the conference coming up?
You know, I have a hit list of all the people I want to see and hang out with. I'll be hanging out with you and Jen at your mixer. I'm gonna go see Berkeley Life, talk to Cellcore, see what trouble Drew and I can cause. Karan's speaking, doing a morning talk, and he was pretty excited about it because I think it was how do you word it? It was maybe not faculty, but his presentation is going to be pretty cool. I know he was excited, so I'm going to try to get up early and go support Karan. But mostly it's like after a long calendar year, like there's no better way to kind of end the year. Go see all of your friends, hang out in Vegas. It's just such a fun event. Everybody's there. So it's a good functional family vibe.
Yeah. Hey, just kind of thinking about some of the people that'll be there. Have you ever kind of explored using products like BrainTap and some of the devices per se around trauma? And have you seen any research or anything related to biomarker improvement? Or I know there's some self-reported improvements that they can demonstrate, but anything you've seen from a more objective standpoint?
Yeah, I've never been like I'm such a I know like what I'm good at and what I'm interested in, and I kind of tune everything else out. So it's like I always see the the helmets people are putting on or the wire thing. And it's like I have no idea what any of that is, and they do like heat map stuff. Or I get a lot of questions about Dr. Amen and his work with the SPECT scans, and I don't know what Dr. Amen says because I've never followed him or paid attention to him really, but he's gotten pretty big. But I know, he's all about the SPECT scan, which is really more of a blood flow, a cerebral blood flow measurement. And so I have a lot of people coming to me of like, well, have you heard of, the SPECT scan in like the Ring of Fire and it shows neuroinflammation? Look at this heat map. And it's like, that's not what that indicates. That is not a measurement of neuroinflammation. That's a measurement of blood flow throughout the brain region. So I don't know where that idea is coming. Is that people misinterpreting what he's saying, or is he pushing that narrative? I have no idea, but this is why I'm very focused on like which clinical biomarkers are best clinically validated and characterized, and then using those to try to validate other emerging markers like the quinolinic acid, for example. But how that then would relate to like different types of brain scans or MRI or BrainTap or any of that other stuff. I mean, that's a whole other world, because that's like there's one of the theories of mental illness is the connectome theory, and the connectome theory is basically built around, well, how are the different brain regions communicating with one another or not? So I kind of focus on the neuroimmune component and the neuroinflammatory component, but like Chris Palmer is more so about the mitochondrial theory and the bioenergetic model, which I try to encapsulate all of them, but a lot of puzzle pieces to the brain health puzzle.
Yeah, and I guess one other question I was thinking about running into people hopefully this weekend. So Dr. Greenblatt, I think, has a book out. One of the kind of, I think the things that's coming back into mental behavioral health as a treatment modality is lithium. Where are you familiar with that area at all? Because I mean, it was kind of like, we 10 years ago, we looked backwards on that like it was witchcraft, but now it seems to have come back into the therapeutic approach.
Yeah, the like lithium orotate. I'm trying to remember what the chemical form of prescription lithium is for like bipolar. I don't remember the chemical form off the top of my head, but different chemical form and much higher dose, whereas then like a low dose lithium orotate over the counter supplement. I'm open to it. Like one of the cool mechanisms about lithium, so quinolinic acid is generated through this IDO1 indolamine 2,3 dioxygenase pathway, which can happen both in the periphery and the brain. But quinolinic acid is kind of like one of the end product metabolites. Now, that pathway ultimately, which 90+% of our tryptophan is always going down that pathway under normal physiological conditions. And it's really to produce NAD as an electron donor, so we can facilitate oxidative phosphorylation and produce ATP. But then if there is upregulated inflammation like lipopolysaccharide, endotoxin, and different tumor necrosis factor and interferon gamma, these pro-inflammatory cytokines, dysregulate that pathway, and that's what causes higher levels of the quinolinic acid as opposed to urenic acid, which is more neuroprotective. But anyways, why I say all of this is lithium acts as an IDO1 inhibitor. So I do think there's potential there, because that lithium, potentially at a titrated dose up and up and up, could have kind of a down regulatory inhibitory effect on that pathway that might be yielding. So I guess anecdotally, if you have elevated quinolinic acid, you could try like low dose lithium orotate and see, does that stabilize your mood? Does it help with anything? Does it reduce your quinolinic acid? Because it is an inhibitor mechanistically.
Yeah. Well, listen, with the last couple of minutes, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about your programs. You mentioned kind of your course coming out, so I'd love to give you an opportunity to kind of just talk through some of that.
Well, thanks, man. Yeah. Functional mental health practitioner certificate program keeps kind of raging and growing. I did my monthly call with my group today. And I think what I take the most pride in is the caliber and quality of person and practitioner that is attracted to the program. I mean, I knew when I launched that program 3.5 years ago, I knew the world needed it. I knew it aligns with my mission and where my heart's at. I knew that it was ahead of its time. But I really take a lot of pride in the practitioners in my community. They're such good people. They're down to earth, they're humble, they're wildly intelligent, and they're very scientific minded. So we're growing and growing. And right now we're dripping out the level 2, which I won't even go into the long story of like what I've had to do to put myself in a professional position to build and launch the level 2 FMHP program. But we just launched the first module, which was our new mold illness course. Then we have mast cell activation syndrome coming out within like a month, neurotransmitters, psychedelics, peptides, and trauma. That's the level 2 curriculum. So I'm super excited to be rolling out some of these new advanced trainings. And then we'll do the neurolongevity index as basically part of that level 2 advanced credential.
Yeah. Well, we were just putting the link up there. We'll make sure to post it in the comments for anybody that wants to take a look and come and enroll and work with you and learn from you. Super interesting topic, really exciting space, finally getting it into the mainstream and people taking the biological component alongside of just the emotional component as well, putting those two things together.
Yeah. We live in such exciting times, like explosions of research everywhere. So the hard part is like, you kind of have to like, which area do I want to focus on, or which field do I want to try to further? Because it's all over the place. Everything that could be research kind of is, although mold illness is still like in the dark ages with mold research, but we'll change that through Biocanic.
Yeah. No, it's pretty amazing how much mold we live in throughout just everything. And it's just so under recognized, in our industry, people are like bloodhounds and they walk into hotel rooms and they can sniff out that moldy room or that moldy, air conditioning unit that hasn't been cleaned. But really exciting times, and really appreciate you joining me today, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow night.
Yeah, thanks, brother. Can't wait to see you tomorrow night in Vegas. We're gonna hang out and tear it up.
Yeah, in a functional health type
in a very functional health kind of way.
Yeah, crushing some supplements and some carboxy. So
exactly.
And, anyway, well, listen, this has been a great episode. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Brendan, and thanks everybody who joined us. If you are watching this as a recording, feel free to drop in comments. We'll make sure to get those answered by Brendan. And looking forward to our next one coming up in 2026. Can't believe it's already at the end of the year.
Jeez. Yeah, amazing.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. Thanks, Brendan. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Happy New Year.